My name is Wren Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and I was standing on a dock in the middle of Lake Superior in February, holding a dead man's hand in mine and listening to an attorney read words my grandfather wrote 14 months before he died. Words that would change everything. When my sister looked at me across that kitchen table and said, "This won't hold." She was wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start somewhere that makes more sense. Let me start with a phone call I took in a parking lot, eating a gas station sandwich, on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, right up until it didn't. Before I do, if you just found this channel and you're already feeling something, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this. Drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read them. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Harlan, Kentucky, in a 2-bedroom house on a hillside that seemed designed to remind you there wasn't enough of anything. My dad worked the mines until his lungs made that impossible. My mom cleaned houses, other people's houses, nicer houses, houses with more rooms than we had people. And she kept everything together with a silence so complete, I spent most of my childhood not being sure whether it was love or just endurance. There were 2 of us, me and my sister Darla, who is 7 years older and left Kentucky at 22, and spent every year after that becoming someone who did not look like where she came from. The way I understood it as a kid was simple. Darla was the one going somewhere. I was the other one. It wasn't said out loud. It was never said out loud. But I understood it the way kids understand things. Through accumulation, through small moments that build into a picture before you're old enough to question the frame. Darla's achievements were brought up at the dinner table. Mine were noted and moved on from. Darla's choices were treated as ambitions. Mine were treated as something to be managed. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it's the foundation of everything that comes later. You need to understand what I believed about myself before you can understand what I was willing to accept. And what I believed, for a long time, was that I was the easy one, the accommodating one, the one whose needs didn't require a lot of attention because she wasn't going anywhere particularly urgent. There was only one person who never made me feel that way. My grandfather, Virgil. Virgil lived on an island. I mean that literally. He owned an island in Lake Superior, off the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, accessible only by boat. He'd acquired it in 1971 for almost nothing because everyone else thought it was uninhabitable. He spent 11 years building the house on it himself, weekends and summers, with his own hands, because that was how Virgil did things. He did not wait for permission or validation or ideal conditions. He decided something needed to exist, and he made it exist. He was the only person who ever looked at me like that. Like I was someone who could decide something needed to exist and make it exist. I became a home health coordinator. I worked, for a nonprofit in Lexington that serves elderly and disabled clients in rural eastern Kentucky. I was good at it. I don't say that to brag. I say it because the work required something specific. The ability to be present with people who are disappearing. To sit in the gap between who someone was and who they are becoming, and to not look away. I was good at not looking away. I earned $41,000 a year. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with 112,000 miles on it. I had a 1-bedroom apartment and a slow-paying credit card I used for car repairs and a savings account that would handle maybe one emergency before it was gone. I had built this life entirely by myself. No safety net, no family money, no one who offered to help and needed to be talked out of it. When I graduated from Eastern Kentucky University, early to save tuition, on a Pell Grant and deli counter wages, my mother came. She brought a box cake. My dad said nothing. I ate the cake in a plastic chair in the gymnasium parking lot and felt something I couldn't name at the time but can name now. I felt like I had done something real, and no one around me had the language for it. Darla sent a card. Inside it she wrote, "Proud of you. with an exclamation point that managed to communicate the opposite. A week later, I called Virgil. I told him I'd graduated. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I always knew you would. Come to the island this summer. I want to show you the new dock." I drove up in July. The dock was beautiful. He'd built it in sections, piece by piece, over the previous fall and spring. It extended further than the old one, had benches on both sides, and looked out at open water that stretched to the horizon. He stood next to me on it, looking out, and said, "Everything I ever built, I built because I thought someone worthy might one day want to stand here." I didn't know if he was talking about the dock, or the island, or something larger. I didn't ask. I just stood there with him in the July heat and thought, this is what it feels like to be seen. The phone call came 2 years later, on a Tuesday in March. I was in the parking lot of a dollar store on New Circle Road, halfway through a terrible gas station sandwich, when my sister's name appeared on my screen. Darla doesn't call to check in. Darla calls when she needs something moved from one column to another. "Grandpa's getting bad," she said. No hello. He had an incident last week. Left the stove on, walked down to the dock at 2 in the morning. The neighbors across the water saw the light and called it in. I talked to his doctor. I put the sandwich down. "Someone needs to be there," she said. "Full time. I can't do it. Brett has his conference cycle. The kids have school. You don't have kids. You work in care. This is basically your job." And if you've ever been told that because you're good at something, because you've structured your life around being capable and present, you are therefore the obvious candidate for the thing no one else wants to do. If you've ever been assigned a burden that someone else had the resources to share but the convenience not to, then you understand exactly what it felt like to sit in that parking lot and hear the word job in quotes. Like caring for someone you love is a skill set. Like love itself is a line item. If that just hit something in you, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, so you don't miss how this ends, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. I promise it's worth it. Okay. There was no question in anything Darla said. No would you, or could you, or what do you think? She had already made the decision. She was simply notifying me of my assignment. I sat in that parking lot for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dash. Then I called her back. "Okay," I said. "I'll go." Not because I had to. Not because she'd cornered me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. For everything that comes later, it matters. I said yes because of a 9-year-old girl on a dock with a broken wrist, crying the whole boat ride to the mainland, and a man who held her hand and never once told her to stop. I gave 2 weeks' notice. My supervisor cried a little. I packed 6 boxes and a duffel bag into my Civic and drove north. I loaded everything onto the ferry in Munising on a Thursday morning in April, when the lake was still cold enough to make your eyes hurt, and I stood at the bow of the boat watching the island appear out of the gray water like something that had been waiting. Virgil was on the dock when we arrived. He was wearing his green and navy flannel, and he looked smaller than I remembered. The way tall people get smaller, from the inside first, when something in them starts to change. When he saw me at the railing, something in his face shifted. "You actually came," he said. "Of course I came." "Darla didn't." "No." He picked up one of my boxes without another word and carried it up the hill. I grabbed 2 more and followed him, and the door closed behind us, and that was the beginning of 11 months that would quietly, without any announcement, change the course of everything. I want to tell you what those 11 months actually looked like, because I think when people hear a story like this, they imagine something cinematic, a noble sacrifice, a slow-motion montage of meaningful moments. The truth is quieter than that. The truth is that caregiving, real caregiving, looks mostly like Tuesday. It looks like 6 a.m. and the smell of coffee and making sure the medications are in the right order on the right shelf. It looks like sitting across a kitchen table from someone who is having a good day and feeling the specific, fragile gratitude of knowing this is a good day, because you've learned to read the difference. It looks like checking the stove before bed. It looks like walking the perimeter of the property at dusk, because he likes the air and the movement, and the walking is good for both of you. And some of your best conversations happen when you're both looking at something else. Virgil had good days and bad days. On the good days, he was still entirely himself, sharp, funny, present. He would do his crossword puzzle at the kitchen table with a pen, not a pencil, which he considered a moral stance. He would tell me stories about the island's early years, about Eleanor, about the winter they had no generator for 3 days and played cards by oil lamp until 2 in the morning. He would ask me questions about my work, about my life, with the focused interest of someone who genuinely wanted the answer. On the bad days, he thought Eleanor was still alive. He would call out for her from the hallway at 3 in the morning, not in distress, exactly, more like ordinary expectation, like he'd simply woken up and was wondering where she'd gotten to. I would find him standing there in his flannel and wool socks, and I would say, quietly, "It's Wren, Grandpa. Let's get you back to bed." And he would look at me for a moment with that distant expression, and then it would focus, and he would say, "Right, of course." And I would walk him back and sit on the floor outside his door until I heard his breathing even out. I kept a care journal, spiral-bound, navy cover, sitting on the kitchen table where I could reach it at any hour. Every day I wrote what he ate, how he slept, any incidents, the quality of his cognition on a simple scale I developed from my training. Medication notes, doctor communications, everything dated, everything signed. I don't know why I was so precise about it from the beginning. Professional habit, maybe. Or maybe some part of me already understood, without naming it, that documentation is a form of bearing witness. Darla called every 2 to 3 weeks. The calls had a structure I learned quickly. She would ask about logistics, refills, appointments, insurance paperwork, and listen to the answers with the focused efficiency of someone in a meeting. And then she would ask, "Is he comfortable?" And I would say yes, and she would say good, and that was usually the end of it. In October, she sent a check for $400. The note said, "For expenses." I deposited it without comment. I didn't know what to do with the feeling it gave me, so I put it somewhere I could look at it later and kept going. I wonder if you've ever been in that position, where someone has the resources to show up, genuinely show up, and instead they send a check that is precisely small enough to acknowledge the obligation without actually meeting it. Where you can feel the math they did to arrive at that number. Drop that in the comments, because I think more people have been in that room than are willing to say so. I read every single one. In November, I called Darla and told her directly that Virgil was declining faster, that the vascular episodes were more frequent and closer together, that she should come. There was a pause. "I'll try to get up there after the holidays," she said. "Darla." I made myself say it plainly. "Come see him." She heard something in my voice. I could tell because the efficiency dropped for just a second, and she said, "I'll look at flights." She didn't come. Christmas happened on the island the way everything happened on the island. Quietly, without announcement, shaped by the lake and the light and the particular weight of being somewhere that the rest of the world can't easily reach. I found an index card in the kitchen drawer in early December. Eleanor's handwriting, a recipe for venison chili with small penciled notes in the margins about adjustments she'd made over the years. I made it on Christmas Eve. Virgil ate 2 bowls and said it tasted exactly right. He said it the way people say things when they mean several things at once. That evening was a good one. One of the last, really good ones. We sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and there was a specific quality to the quiet that I recognized. It was the kind of quiet that means someone is about to say something that matters. He took the analog watch off his wrist, set it on the table between us. "You have one like it," he said. "You gave it to Mom. She gave it to me when I was 16. He nodded. He looked at both watches for a long moment, his on the table, mine on my wrist. Then he reached across and tapped the back of my hand, once, gently. "You know what I always liked about you, Ren?" I waited. "You showed up, every single time, without being asked." My throat closed. I looked at the 2 watches on the table, and I did not say anything because I couldn't say anything, not right then, and I knew he would understand that. "I asked you this time," he said, "but you would have come anyway, eventually." After he went to bed, I sat at the table for a long time. I looked at the 2 watches. I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who shows up without being asked. How it is both the best thing about you and the thing that everyone else learns to rely on so completely that they stop noticing it. How love, when it becomes predictable, becomes invisible. I put both watches back on my wrist, one on each side. I don't know why. It just felt right. Virgil died on a Wednesday morning in February. The lake was making that sound it makes in winter, low and continuous, less like water than like weather. He had asked, on a good day 2 weeks prior, if I would crack the window. He said he liked the air off the lake in the mornings. I had propped it open 3 inches with a book. He went quietly. I was holding his hand. There was no one else on the island. I sat with him for a while after. I don't know exactly how long. Then I went to the kitchen and called Darla. She arrived 2 days later on the afternoon ferry. She came with Brett, her husband, in a fleece vest, carrying a rolling suitcase that seemed excessive for the length of their stay. She hugged me at the dock. It was the hug of someone fulfilling a requirement, brief, efficient, correct. She walked up the hill without waiting for me. I watched her go, and then I picked up the bags she'd left on the dock and followed. She moved through the house with a particular kind of attention. Not grief exactly, more like inventory. She paused at the bookshelves. She paused at the window that looks out over the water. She opened the door to Virgil's bedroom and stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came back to the kitchen and said, "We should get the property appraised before we talk to the attorney." I was standing at the counter. I had not moved. I looked at my sister, this woman I had grown up with, who knew the same kitchen table and the same box cakes and the same silence. And I felt something that was not anger. It was older than anger. It was the feeling of being confirmed in something you hoped you were wrong about. "His name was Virgil," I said. She looked at me. She straightened her wedding ring. She said, "I know that, Ren," in the tone people use when they want to end a conversation without admitting they lost it. Raymond Holt drove up from Marquette 3 days later. He was 67, silver-haired, unhurried in the way of someone who has delivered difficult news often enough that he's stopped performing composure and simply has it. He set his leather portfolio on the kitchen table, the same table where I'd kept the care journal, where Virgil had done his crosswords in pen, where 2 watches had sat side by side on Christmas evening. He opened the portfolio. He looked at Darla. He looked at me. And then he began to read. The property known as Cutler Island, including the residence, all structures, and the surrounding water rights, is left in its entirety to my granddaughter Wren Calloway in recognition of her presence, her faithfulness, and her understanding, which she demonstrated not in words but in action, every day, without complaint and without condition. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the lake. To my granddaughter Darla Calloway Pruitt, I leave my library of navigational charts, because she always liked to know where she was going. He already knew. Before any of this started, before the ferry, before the care journal, before the Christmas chili and the 2 watches on the table, Virgil already knew who would come and who wouldn't. And he didn't just feel something about it, he did something about it, quietly, deliberately, 14 months before he died, with full documentation and a witnessing physician and an attorney who had spent 31 years making sure that the right people could not be argued out of what they were owed. If that hit you the way it hit me when I finally understood it, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. It's a small thing, but when you're standing in a kitchen in February, listening to a dead man keep his promise, small things mean more than you can say. Darla's face did not collapse. That is not who she is. What it did was move, through several things in quick succession, like weather passing over water, and then it closed into something controlled and very still. She pressed her lips together, she straightened her ring, and she said, "He wasn't competent, he had dementia. This won't hold." Raymond Holt did not raise his voice. He did not shift in his chair. He reached into the leather portfolio with the deliberate calm of someone who has been in this room before. Not this kitchen, not this island, but this exact moment where grief tips sideways into contest. And he removed a single document and placed it on the table. "The will was executed 14 months ago," he said, "prior to any formal diagnosis, by a man whose attending physician documented full cognitive capacity at the time of signing. This is that documentation." He set it down the way you set something down when you want it to stay there. Darla looked at it. Brett, who had been standing near the door with his arms crossed, looked at the floor. The room held everything in it: the smell of the lake through the cracked window, the care journal still on the counter where I'd left it, the 2 mugs of coffee Raymond had politely declined. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. Virgil had already said it, in ink, 14 months ago, in a room I wasn't in, with a witness I'd never met, because he understood, better than I did, that the things you mean have to be made undeniable. Darla picked up the document. She read it. I watched her read it, the way I've watched a lot of people receive information they weren't prepared for. The eyes moving, the face very still, the body doing the quiet work of recalibrating. She set it back down. She looked at me. And I saw it, just for a second, underneath the controlled stillness, underneath the navy blazer and the pressed crease and the wedding ring she kept straightening. I saw something that was not anger and not grief, but something closer to recognition. Like she was seeing, maybe for the first time, the full shape of a choice she'd made and called something else. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then it closed. "I'll need to speak with my own attorney," she said. Raymond nodded. "That is absolutely your right." Brett touched her arm. She didn't look at him. She picked up her bag from the chair. She didn't look at me again. She walked out through the front door and down the hill to the dock, and Brett followed, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched them go. Raymond stayed for another 20 minutes. He walked me through the administrative steps: transfer of deed, county notification, water rights registration. He spoke slowly and clearly, like someone who understood that the person across from him was processing more than paperwork. When he was done, he closed the portfolio and held it in his lap for a moment. "He talked about you," he said, "when we drew up the will. He talked for a long time." I didn't ask what Virgil said. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I didn't need the words. Maybe because the document was the words. Maybe because some things are truer when you let them stay quiet. Raymond put on his coat. At the door he paused and said, "He was a good man." "Yes," I said, "he was." After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a while. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something I can only describe as the sensation of a weight you've been carrying for so long you stopped feeling it. Finally, without ceremony, being set down. Not dropped, set down, with intention. I opened the care journal to the last entry I'd written. February, his breathing, the window propped 3 inches with a book, the quality of the morning light. I closed it. I need to tell you about the moment I almost didn't hold it together. Because everything I've described, the attorney, the document, Darla's face, that was not the hardest moment. The hardest moment was smaller than that. It was 2 days after Raymond left. I was alone on the island. Darla and Brett had taken the afternoon ferry the same day as the reading, without saying goodbye. The lake had gone gray and very flat, the way it does in late February when the weather can't decide what it wants to be. I was washing one of Virgil's mugs at the sink, the ceramic one with a chip on the handle that he refused to throw away because Eleanor had given it to him. And I looked out the window at the dock, and I thought, he's not going to be here tomorrow either. Not the island, not the will, him. The specific weight of him on the dock in the morning, the crossword with the pen, the way he said my name like it was a complete sentence. I put the mug down and I sat on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, I just sat down. And I stayed there for a while, on the cold tile, with my back against the cabinet, looking at the underside of the kitchen table where I'd eaten 100 meals and kept a year's worth of notes, and watched my grandfather slowly become less of himself and entirely more of something I couldn't name until I stopped trying. This is the part I want you to sit with for a second, because I mean it. The people who stay are not saints. They are not performing nobility. They are people who love someone and cannot find the off switch for it, and that is both the most ordinary thing in the world and the most extraordinary. If you have ever been that person, if you have ever stayed in a room that everyone else found a reason to leave, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the rest of this story is for you. I got up off the floor. I washed the mug. I put it back on the shelf with the chip facing out, the way Virgil kept it. I went to bed. I should tell you about Darla. Not the version of her I presented to myself when I was angry, but the real one. Because the real one is more complicated and ultimately more true. Darla grew up in the same house I did. She saw the same scarcity, the same silence, the same father who said nothing when someone should have spoken. But she was 7 years older, which means she saw more of it before she was old enough to understand it, which means it landed differently. She understood, by the time I was old enough to notice anything, that the way out was to become someone the world couldn't ignore. So she did. She built a life that didn't look like Harlan by sheer force of will, and she protected that life with everything she had, because she had learned at a specific, formative age that if you let things get close, they cost you. She loved Virgil. I believe that. I don't think she would have argued about the will if she didn't, because you don't fight for things you never wanted. What she couldn't do, what genuinely seemed beyond her, was sit with him while he disappeared. The dementia terrified her in a way she couldn't manage or reframe or outlast, because dementia doesn't respond to efficiency. It just takes what it takes, on its own schedule, and Darla had spent 20 years building a life where she controlled the schedule. So she gave the thing she couldn't do to the person she knew would do it. And she told herself that was a practical decision, a reasonable division of labor. And I genuinely think, she believed that. She was wrong. But she wasn't malicious. She was afraid, and she was selfish. And those two things are not the same as evil, even when they cause the same damage. I sat with this understanding in my car on the ferry dock in Munising, a week after the reading, waiting for a crossing that had been delayed by weather. I sat with it the way you sit with something you know is true, but haven't finished feeling yet. She was afraid. She gave her fear to me and called it an assignment. And my grandfather, who saw exactly what was happening, who had seen it his whole life in the specific way that old people who love you see things you don't yet have language for, made sure that what I gave could not be taken. The ferry horn sounded. The ramp went down. I sat in my car and did not move for a moment, and I felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the complicated residue of the past week, something beginning to settle. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first layer. I drove back to Lexington. I needed to be somewhere I could think without the island thinking back at me, without every corner holding a specific memory, without the lake making its opinions known at all hours. My apartment felt smaller than I remembered. My Civic felt older. I made tea and sat on my couch and looked at my hands. The thin gold chain of the locket, the silver watch with the scratched crystal, the slightly roughened knuckles of someone who has spent a year doing physical, intimate, invisible work. I thought about what Virgil had said on Christmas. You showed up, every single time, without being asked. I had spent 34 years believing that being the one who showed up was simply who I was, a fact of my character, like eye color, like height. It had never occurred to me that it was also a choice. That every time I said yes when someone needed me and no one else stepped forward, I was making an active decision about what I valued, about what I thought love required. It had never occurred to me that someone was watching, that someone was keeping track, not in a transactional way, not as a ledger to be balanced, but in the way you keep track of things that matter to you. The way Virgil built that dock, piece by piece, because he thought someone worthy might one day want to stand there. He had built something for me, too, quietly, without announcement, 14 months before I needed it. I opened my laptop. I started looking up the county assessor's records for Cutler Island. Then I closed the laptop. That could wait. I opened the care journal instead. I sat on my couch in Lexington and I read it from the beginning. I did not move back to the island immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story would be neater if I did. If I just turned the car around and drove north and stood on the dock at sunrise with a sense of arrival. That's not what happened. What happened was that I went back to Lexington and spent 6 weeks being a person who owned an island and had no idea what to do with that sentence. I got a part-time position with a home health agency in Marquette. Remote administrative work to start, on-site eventually. I called a contractor on the Upper Peninsula who came highly recommended by the man who ran the Munising ferry dock and knew everyone within 100 miles. I made lists. I crossed things off. I made more lists. I am, at my core, someone who processes grief by making sure the practical things are handled. Because when your father's lungs go, and your mother has a stroke, and your grandfather's mind starts leaving before his body does, you learn that someone has to be the person who calls the right number. I had always been that person. I remained that person. I just started doing it for myself. Darla contacted an attorney in Columbus. I know this because Raymond Holt called me 3 weeks after the reading, in his quiet, unhurried way, to let me know that a letter had been sent to his office contesting the will on grounds of undue influence. He explained what that meant, that the argument would be that I had manipulated Virgil during a period of diminished capacity into changing his estate plan in my favor. I sat with the phone against my ear and looked at the care journal on my coffee table. What do I need to do? I asked. Nothing yet, Raymond said. I have the physician's documentation, I have the dated will, and I have something else. He paused. Virgil kept a journal too. He gave it to me at the same meeting where we executed the will. He asked me to hold it and produce it if it was ever needed. I didn't say anything for a moment. He kept a journal, I repeated. For the last 2 years of his life, including the 11 months you were on the island. I want to tell you what it felt like to read Virgil's journal. Raymond sent me a copy. The original stayed with him for the legal proceedings, and I sat at my kitchen table in Lexington on a Wednesday evening in March with a cup of tea that went cold while I read. His handwriting was the same as it had always been, deliberate, slightly formal, the handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse and saw no reason to abandon it. The entries were not long. He was not a man who used many words when fewer would do. But they were specific, and they were precise, and they were entirely, unmistakably Virgil. February 14th. Wren made soup. She found Eleanor's recipe in the drawer. I did not tell her about the drawer. She found it on her own. March 3rd. Bad day. Wren sat outside my door until nearly 4 in the morning. She did not know I could hear her breathing. I found it helpful. June 22nd. I asked Wren if she ever resented being here. She said no. I believe her. She is the kind of person who does not say things she doesn't mean. August 9th. Called Raymond. Told him about the journal. He will hold it. December 25th. Good day. We had Eleanor's chili. I told Wren what I have always thought about her. I hope she heard it. She went quiet, which means she did. I read that last one 3 times. Then I put the journal face down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a while. He had documented it. Not for the will. The will was already written. He had documented it because he wanted a record to exist. Because he understood, in the way that people who have lived long enough understand things, that the invisible work of love needs a witness, even if that witness is only a spiral-bound notebook kept by an old man with a fountain pen in a house on an island in the middle of a lake. The contest was dropped 6 weeks later. Raymond called me on a Tuesday morning. My Tuesdays, I have noticed, tend to be significant, and told me in 4 sentences. The physician's documentation, the dated will, and the journal together made an unambiguous record. Darla's attorney had advised her that proceeding was not in her interest. "It's done," Raymond said. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me. I just kept the file." I heard about what happened next through a woman named Gail, Virgil's nearest neighbor, a retired schoolteacher who lived on the mainland shore and had known him for 30 years and called me every few weeks to check in, which I found I needed more than I expected. Gail told me that word had gotten around the Munising community the way word gets around in small lakeside places. Not through announcement, but through accumulation, one conversation at a time, until the shape of the thing is generally understood without anyone having held a meeting about it. People knew that Virgil had left the island to the granddaughter who had been there. People knew that the other granddaughter had contested it and lost. People knew what that meant. Gail didn't editorialize. She just told me what she'd heard. But toward the end of the call, she said quietly, people respected him enormously, and they could see, all winter, the light on in that house. I didn't celebrate. That's not something I know how to do, with the suffering of someone I grew up with, even when that suffering is a consequence of their own choices. What I felt was something more like a sad, specific relief. The relief of a story arriving at its true shape, even when the true shape costs everyone something. My father is in a memory care facility in Lexington. I visit him every week. He doesn't always know me. Some days he thinks I'm my mother, which is a grief of its own particular texture. But some days he looks at me and says my name, Wren, and I sit with him and we watch whatever is on television, and sometimes he holds my hand without knowing he's doing it. I tell you this because I think it would be easy to hear this story and believe that I became a person who stopped being available to people who hadn't fully earned it. That I learned some lesson about only giving to those who give back, about protecting my energy, about the transactional arithmetic of love. That would be a simpler story. It wouldn't be mine. I still show up. I just know now that showing up is a choice. That it is not an inevitability written into my character by the accident of being the easy one, the flexible one, the one without kids. It is something I decide, each time, with full knowledge of what it costs and what it means. That distinction between a life that happens to you and a life you keep choosing is the thing Virgil's journals made real for me in a way nothing else had. Darla called me in April. It was the first time we'd spoken since the reading. She called on a Sunday morning, and I saw her name on the screen, and I let it ring twice before I answered. Not out of spite, but because I needed the 2 rings to decide who I was going to be in the conversation. I answered. She didn't say sorry exactly. Darla doesn't do exact apologies. She does something adjacent to them, something that acknowledges a truth without fully inhabiting it. She said, "I think I handled things badly." I said, "Yes, you did." Silence. "I couldn't be there," she said, "with him like that. I couldn't watch it." "I know," I said, and I did know. That was the complicated part. "I should have found a way." "Yes." Another silence. Then, "Is the house okay? The island?" And something about that question, its smallness, its domesticity, the fact that it was the only way she knew to ask if I was okay, made me feel something that wasn't warmth exactly, but was adjacent to it, the residue of a shared childhood. The 2 box cakes and the 2 different ways of surviving the same house. "The house is fine," I said. "The dock needs some work in the spring." "Virgil would have done it himself," she said. "Yeah," I said, "he would have." We talked for 11 more minutes. Not about the will, not about the attorney, not about any of it. We talked about our father, the facility, the good days, the way he sometimes holds your hand without knowing he's doing it. It was not a reconciliation. It was something more honest than that. 2 people who share a history, acknowledging that the history is real, without pretending the rest of it isn't. I don't know what Darla and I will be to each other going forward. I'm not performing forgiveness, and I'm not performing distance. I'm just letting it be what it is, one Sunday call at a time, and seeing what it becomes. I moved back to the island in May. The contractor had done the structural work over the winter. New insulation, updated wiring, the dock repaired and extended slightly further than before. I came off the ferry on a Tuesday morning with 9 boxes and a duffel bag and a plant I'd kept alive in my Lexington apartment for 4 years that I decided deserved to live somewhere with better light. The house smelled like wood and cold air and something underneath that I couldn't name for the first few days and then recognize on the 4th morning. It smelled like him. Not cologne, not anything specific, just the particular atmosphere of a life lived deliberately in one place for a very long time. I put the care journal on the kitchen table. I put Eleanor's recipe box in the drawer where I'd found it. I put my watch on the shelf next to Virgil's, which I'd brought back from the mainland in a small velvet bag Raymond had given me at our last meeting. 2 watches, same shelf, same light. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the lake do what the lake does, which is move, constantly, in every direction, without any apparent concern for what anyone on shore might prefer. I thought about Virgil. Not about missing him exactly, though I do, every day, in the specific and ordinary way you miss someone who was your truest compass. I thought about what he said on the dock in July, years before any of this. Everything I ever built, I built because I thought someone worthy might one day want to stand here. I am standing here. I know that now. Not as a reward, not as a verdict on anyone else, but simply as the truest thing about where I am. I am 34 years old. I have a Honda Civic with 112,000 miles on it. I have a plant on the windowsill that is already doing better in this light. I have a kitchen table and a navy journal and 2 watches on a shelf, and a view of water that goes all the way to the horizon. And I have, for the first time in my life, the specific and unhurried sensation of being exactly where I decided to be. My name is Wren Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and for the first time, that sentence feels complete. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it. Has someone ever seen you clearly, really seen you, the way you actually are rather than the way you're convenient to need, and done something about it, quietly, without telling you, in a way you only understood later? Leave it in the comments. Tell me the story, or just tell me yes. I read every single one, and I mean that. And if this story stayed with you, if something in Wren's 11 months on that island, or in the way Virgil kept his journal, or in the 2 watches on the shelf, landed somewhere real, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share this with someone who needs to hear that the invisible work of love does not go unseen, even when it feels that way. Especially when it feels that way. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.